First of all, I want to congratulate you on the terrific event last night. I don't know if you ever had such a successful event like the one you did last night, but I think it speaks volumes about the importance of this organization. And from my point of view as Israel's ambassador, specifically to work on strengthening ties between the United States and Israel, and also at the job that Michael is doing at running the organization. For me, Mike is kind of a go-to guy on a lot of the things that deal with enhancing the relationship between the United States and Israel. He's also my go-to guy on Churchill issues and also on baseball issues, but he doesn't know as much about baseball as he thinks he knows, but he's willing to talk about it anyway. I understand that the new DCM in the embassy is Benji. Where's Benji? Is he here? Benji is right here, so raise your hand so everyone sees you. That's the new name. And also Tammy Ben Chaim is here. Could you raise your hand in the back? Our new head of public diplomacy. And there's another two other people who I want to recognize. Two of the finest people I could work with. I see definitely one here. I don't necessarily see the other one. I understand he's moving around his luggage. But apparently I get along very well with people named Yaakov. My father was named Yaakov too, so maybe that has something to do with it. The first is Yaakov Amidjor, who I know is a great... Is he here? He's upstairs. Well, good. Don't tell him I said anything nice about him either. But he's... in all my years, I don't think I've ever worked with a more impressive, not only on a professional level, but also on a personal level. So I think it's great that he has this relationship. And my colleague and partner in the embassy for a number of years, Yaakov Ayish, who's here, General Ayish. But I must say, both Amidjor and Ayish, they worked with me during the easy years of the previous administration. You're not with me during these tough years that we've had to deal with. But seriously, I don't know if an Israeli ambassador in the 70-year history of our state has had the privilege to experience the type of year that I've had the privilege to experience this past year. Two decisions were made that were truly historic. We use that term history too often. But in the last year, there were two truly historic decisions. One of them is, I think, obvious, which is the decision of the President of the United States to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which happened last December. But the second part of that, the seifa, as we say in the Talmudic language, the second part of it was the decision to give that practical meaning by moving the embassy last May. Give a round of applause to the U.S. Embassy. But in the same week, actually, that the embassy was removed, the President of the United States made another, what I think is a truly monumental decision, which is to withdraw the United States from the nuclear deal with Iran and to restore American sanctions. Now, that started in October last year, if you remember, this month, when the President refused to recertify the deal. It continued with his decision in May, and then now more recently, his decisions to renew sanctions, which he did a couple of months ago, and when they've made clear that they're going to do it again in November, all the oil sanctions. Now, there are scholars here of the U.S.-Israel relationship over the last 7 years, people who know a lot about the relationship. I do not know if there was a single decision that has ever been made by an American president that has been more important to Israel's security than the decision that President Trump made. Now, there's two other historic decisions that come to mind when you're trying to work out what's the most monumental. First was Truman's decision, of course, to recognize the newly established state of Israel. But Truman was the first, but he was not alone. Many others followed. And then, of course, the one that comes to mind, can I get a water if it's, the other one that comes to mind to most people who are playing this nice parlor game with me is probably Nixon's decision to rearm Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The difference with that decision is that ultimately Nixon was the one who authorized it. But he wasn't the first one to do it. There were other people who forced that decision. One of them is Scoop Jackson. You recognize Secretary of State. The other one is Admiral Zumwalt, that some of you in the military may remember as well. And those who know the backstory of what happened in '73 know that, yes, you give the person the decision, the credit for making that decision, and Nixon did make that decision, but he was operating in a different context with a lot of other people that wanted him even to make that decision earlier. In the case of President Trump, it was President Trump himself who drove this whole process. And he did it not just against the wishes of most of the leaders around the world who were pleading with him not to do it. He did it against the wishes of senior people within his own administration. So that has a little bit of that Marshall Truman situation that occurred in 1948. But this is a remarkable decision, and I think it was, from my point of view, it's a hinge of history. And it's something that I, as Israel's ambassador, am deeply grateful for, because this is something I've spoken about at, I think, last year and the year before, and I've been speaking about Iran for 18 years. And the Prime Minister has been speaking about it even longer than that. The nuclear deal with Iran is a threat to the survival of the State of Israel. Not to the security of the State of Israel, to the survival of the State of Israel. That's what it is. That doesn't mean that people who supported the deal want to cause harm to the State of Israel. I'm not questioning the motives of those who supported, and there's people who are in this room who may have thought for different reasons that this was the better alternative to take. That's fine. But I have a different view. The Prime Minister of Israel has a different view. Our Arab neighbors have a different view. We don't know that much about the region because we just live there. So I know that the European ambassadors, they see things different, and European leaders, because they got a good look from a few thousands of miles away. But we who live in the region think this deal was an absolute disaster, and that's why we're so grateful. Why was it a disaster? And it's important to remember it now, because we get all focused on the specific details of what's going to happen this or that week with this or that decision. This deal put Israel on cruise control, heading over a cliff. That's what the deal is. Because ultimately, it puts restrictions on Iran's nuclear program that are temporary and that are automatically removed in a few years. And in those two words, automatically removed, you understand why Israel was opposed to the deal. And no one bothers to ask a simple question. Well, if this actually prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons, why would a country like Israel that's threatened openly with annihilation, why would we not be the first ones to support it? And the answer is because it didn't prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. What it did, it gave them a clear path to legitimately becoming a military nuclear power. That was the impacted deal. A few years, cruise control, and you're right off a cliff. And in the meantime, what's going to happen is that while you're going down that path, you're being hit with rocks, and then bigger rocks, and ultimately with precision-guided missiles that are going to go after your car before you even get to that cliff. And this is why the decision of the president is so important, because he could have made a decision at the beginning to say, you know what, this is not going to go off the cliff on my watch. And even if I'm a two-term president, it may not go off the cliff, right? It's 10 to 15 years. And he could have said, I don't want to deal with it now. But he didn't. And he didn't necessarily have to deal with all of the dangers that we're confronting now as we get closer and closer to that cliff. But he is dealing with it. And not only did we have a deal in place as of a few months ago that will enable Iran not to sneak in or break into the nuclear club, but walk into the nuclear club. We had a deal. The price of that deal, that in itself would be a bad deal, by the way. Just that. Just a trade-off. You can't do it today, but you can do it tomorrow. That's a bad deal for the State of Israel. That on its own would have made this deal a disaster, because it would given a regime that openly calls for the annihilation of Israel a clear path to a nuclear arsenal. That in itself would make it, in my point of view, a deal that we would need to fight. But there was a price to the deal. And the price to the deal was the removal of all the sanctions. And Iran was facing a headwind of sanctions that was causing major problems and decisions that Iran had to make 5 years ago. Do we support Hezbollah or do we support the Houthis? Do we manufacture this weapon system, or do we manufacture that weapon system? They had to make choices, not between guns and butter. Iranians don't make choices between guns and butter. That regime makes choices between guns and guns, or small guns and bigger guns. And they were facing this headwind of sanctions, and what happened is the sanctions are removed, and now they have a tailwind of sanctions relief. And one of the things the opponents of the deal, frankly, I think never truly understood is the extent of the money that was going to pour into Iran. Because what people argued about is this $50 million or $100 million or $150 million. There were all these numbers that were thrown around, which were the money that were frozen in the bank accounts of Iranian oil that had been sold that couldn't be repatriated back to Iran, and that money was in bank accounts. And there was a big discussion how much money was there. Are you giving them $50 billion? Are you giving 100? You give them 150. That was the signing bonus of the bad deal. That was the small money. The big money is Iran's ability to sell oil. That's the big money of the deal. When the sanctions were in place, Iran was selling 1 million barrels a day. Anyone know today what Iran is selling? Before, how much? Almost 3. Now let's do some math. You didn't think you were going to be in class this morning, but let's do some math. 2 million extra barrels, roughly. It's about 1.8, but let's say 2 million. What's the price of oil today? 80. 75. Okay, so how much of that is a day? How much money a day? 160 million. Okay? Most months, we're not in February, 30 times 160 million is how much? About $5 billion a month. A month. Wow. People say, wow, yeah, no one ever thought about that. $60 billion a year. Now we'll take 10 to 15, and now we've got now $600 billion to almost $900 billion. That's at a delta of 2 million extra barrels. But Iran once was exporting 4 million barrels a day. And as the investments pour into Iran, as French companies like Total and others were to come into Iran and start building up their capacity, that's not going to be 60 billion. It's going to easily go to 100 billion a year in a few years. So you're talking about well over $1 trillion that are pouring into Iran. And I'd love to tell you that the Iranians are going to use this money to establish a GI Bill for returning members of the Revolutionary Guard. But all this was going to do, and it was totally, absolutely predictable before. All what was going to happen is it was going to fuel Iran's war machine in the region. And to think anything else is simply to bury your head in the sand. And they were saying, you got to give credit to the Iranians because they didn't lie. They tweeted out the day before the deal was signed, you remember it, Israel will be destroyed in 25 years, which I think was a very dangerous tweet for the supreme leader to make. Maybe that's just because I'm a more spiritual person. When he says 25 years, the state of Israel will be gone. But they said clearly, we're not changing our policies. We're going to continue our policies. And they did. And you see that in Iraq through the militias, and you see that in Syria through their attempt to entrench themselves there militarily. You see it in Lebanon through Hezbollah. You see it with the Houthis. You just empowered this tremendous enemy. And there are lots of things that were said about this deal that were not true. A lot of things. And it wasn't an honest debate at the time. People said that this deal blocks Iran's path to the bomb. It doesn't. Now, if they would have said, we believe with a high degree of certainty that it temporarily blocks their path, okay, that would be a somewhat accurate statement. But they didn't. They say it blocks Iran's path to the bomb. No, it paves Iran's path to an arsenal. That's the truth. The second thing is they say, well, it freezes their program. It doesn't freeze their program. Those of you, people in here actually know this, but most people outside think Iran's program is in a freezer for 10 to 15 years. It's not. They're doing R&D on advanced centrifuges as we're having lunch. Right now, on IR2, IR4, IR6, IR8, those are the more advanced centrifuges. And my favorite line in this 160-page farce of a deal, my favorite line was that Iran, during the course of this deal, can only do R&D on the IR2, 4, 6, and 8. That's like saying to Apple that over the next decade, they can only do R&D on the iPhone 12, 13, 14, and 15. Thank you very much. Think about what this deal was for Iran. We mothball our old technology, like the Apple II, while we continue to actually work to develop more advanced centrifuges, so that when all those restrictions are removed in 10 or 15 years, when the people who did this debate here are sitting on a beach somewhere, when those restrictions are removed, they can enrich uranium to their heart's delight with much more powerful and much faster centrifuges. And meanwhile, they work on their ballistic missile program. And all they need to do then is to weaponize. And it's clear that they're seeking nuclear weapons. And that was another falsehood that was said, that Iran did not seek nuclear weapons. It's actually in the preamble of the whole JCPOA. Well, everyone saw last May, when the Prime Minister held a international, I don't know exactly, it wasn't quite a press conference, but when he stood there and he showed why this was a lie. When our intelligence agencies, intelligence agency, I should say, and how about a round of applause for the Mossad? And I give a lot of credit to the director of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, because that would have never gone to the Prime Minister's desk if it were not for him. And I give a lot of credit to the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister has to authorize such an operation. But we showed the world that they're lying. When Libya and South Africa, when they got out of their nuclear weapons business, first thing they do is get rid of the archive. Well, the Iranians were keeping the archive. And they're keeping the archive for a reason. You know, right when the Prime Minister did his press conference, I happened to be on the phone with a rabbi. And sometimes rabbis can really give you good advice when it comes to nuclear issues. So he kind of got to the heart of the matter right away, because he says, okay, so you have this archive in a vault in Tehran, right? He says, it's pretty clear what they're trying to do. He says to me, I won't forget it, he says, you know, you don't save chametz on Pesach unless you're going to eat it after Pesach. So that's a pretty good way of understanding their program. And they were saving it in those vaults because in 10, 15 years, when those restrictions are removed, and they have the ballistic missiles that are capable of actually putting a warhead on top of it and also reaching here, not Israel, not Europe, but here at the end of those 10, 15 years, then they can weaponize it. And we exposed it. And so you have the lie of saying that it blocks Iran's path to the bomb. You have the lie of saying that the program is frozen when it's actually advancing during these years. You have the lie of whitewashing all of the possible military dimensions of Iran's program. But you know what the biggest lie of all? Of all. And this was the main thrust of the effort to sell the deal, that it was going to push war further away. That was the biggest lie of all. Because that brought war much closer to Israel's border. I don't know if people understand how close Israel was and could be to being involved in a confrontation that could lead to an escalation, and we could be dealing with a conventional war well before you're dealing with the problem of 10 or 15 years when Iran could walk into the nuclear weapons club. It's a constant problem that Israel's facing with all the issues we have in Gaza. What we're dealing with in Syria are orders of magnitude greater. And the deal ended up empowering Iran, fueling its war machine, and bringing war literally right to Israel's border. This is why the decision of President Trump is so important, because he takes this car on cruise control, he grabs the wheel, and he turns it. He just turned the car. Now, he didn't solve the problem yet of the sunset clause, because the deal's still there. He hasn't done that. We're not out of the woods there. And we still have a regime that is committed to doing everything it can to endanger us, to endanger our neighbors, and endanger the world. But what this decision did is it weakened that regime. I say $60 billion a year now. So think about 2, 3, 4 years. How much money now is being sucked out of the talents of Iran's regime And I don't know, you have to, I guess, go to sophisticated seminars at Harvard. I never was at Harvard. I just was in Wharton. I know the president went there as well, and Oxford. I never made it to Harvard. But apparently if you go to a Harvard seminar, that's when they explain why giving people who want to kill you hundreds of billions of dollars is a good idea and is going to make you safer. I think if you ask simple people with common sense and moral sense, they'll tell you that preventing such a regime from having hundreds of billions of dollars actually improves your security. So I can't tell you that we've solved all the problems of Iran, but I see this shift as weakening Iran's regime tremendously and giving us an opportunity to get onto a different course. And it is literally a hinge of history. And yesterday, you asked Pompeo, what would you define it? Well, I define it very clearly. It's very clear to me what the United States is doing. It shifted its policy from containing a nuclear-armed Iran, which is what that deal does. Because all they're doing is we hope we delay it for 10 or 15 years and maybe somebody wins the lottery and something happens. They shifted from containment to prevention, to preventing a nuclear-armed Iran. And they shifted from accommodating Iran's aggression to rolling back Iran's aggression. Now, you haven't seen the full force, I think, yet of that policy, but it's clear that they have changed. And it's also clear that they have had a tremendous impact in a very short amount of time. And frankly, with one powerful arrow in the quiver, which is the economic pressures that they're putting on. Now, a lot of people were saying, you remember this, that the United States really couldn't affect much of a change in Iran because if it did it alone, that the sanctions regime would never be strong. Remember that? I know it's hard to remember because it's about, what, 4 or 5 months ago, so people forget that. But everybody was saying, look, if the U.S. just renews sanctions on its own, it doesn't have this international sanction regime, and it's the international sanctions regime that got the pressure. Nonsense. The United States is a $21 trillion economy. Iran is a $400 billion economy. It's not a choice. The question is the U.S. administration prepared to force companies to make that choice? That's the question. The United States has the economic power to do it, and the United States is using the economic power. And we went from a headwind to a tailwind, and now we're back to a headwind. Iran's economy was growing about 12% 2 years ago. Now it's in a tailspin. You see it with a currency that's collapsing. You see it with unemployment rates, inflation rates. You see it with businesses leaving. British Airlines and the French oil companies, car companies, German banks. And frankly, it doesn't matter what Europe's political class says about the deal because all their companies are leaving. So all the money that could have flown into Iran is now going out of Iran. And so a lot of the impact that this is having in Iran is also what would not have happened, or what could have happened, I should say, had this moment in time not happened. So all these plans, all these projects that would have increased that 2 million barrels a day to 3 million or 4 million or beyond, now all of a sudden everything is pulling back. And look at the impact that it's having on oil sales. Now, the Secretary of State got into that a little bit, but I think you will see when the numbers come out a dramatic change from this extra 2 million barrels a day to a significantly lower reduction by the time the November sanctions take effect, even by that time. And I expect that within a few months, America alone will have oil sales from Iran underneath what they were when you had the entire international sanctions regime on Iran in 2013, the United States alone. And they're just getting started. Financial sanctions can squeeze them very hard, and I think some of those may well come. And I think there'll be a lot of other areas because they're determined to maximize pressures against them. And we've also seen a change in U.S. strategic posture in the region. You mentioned about, well, is it rollback? It's not. And, I'm not going to speak for the American administration what their policy is, and the Secretary of State didn't want to put a label on it, but I can just tell you about facts. So 6 months ago, there was concern that the United States was simply going to walk away from Syria. That is not the case. And the Secretary of State said yesterday, and other, Ambassador Bolton and others have said it publicly as well, that the United States is not leaving Syria until Iran leaves Syria. Now, that's a big shift. Now, something happened from 6 months ago to now, and it was withdrawing from the nuclear deal with Iran and understanding that you're going to have to push back and you're not going to cede the most important strategic areas to the Iranians, but that you're actually going to push back. And you see a change in the U.S. strategic posture in Syria. And you see the shift to the U.S. staying in Tanif. You have seen Israel push back against Iran's attempt to entrench itself. And the third thing that you have is you have the Iranian economy in this tailspin. And those three things are no doubt affecting thinking within Iran. The question is, will it change the thinking in Iran? They're invested a lot in Syria. They want to control that vassal state. They've invested a lot of money, a lot of people in Syria. But the question is, what price will they pay by continuing this strategy? And now I think the dynamic has changed. It hasn't affected the decision-making in Iran yet, but with the U.S. saying it's going to stay, with Israel continuing to make clear it's going to continue to act, which we have over a couple hundred times in the last few years, and with increasing economic pressures, you very well may see a change. And I think, I don't know, but I'm hopeful that we will see a change. And I also know that they have a lot less money to buy a lot fewer guns to cause a lot fewer problems in the region. And I think no matter what happens, that's a good thing for Israel, it's a good thing for our neighbors, and it's a good thing for the world. What I think the Iranians will try to do is to wait the president out. I think that's what they're going to try to do, to stay in the deal and to wait him out. And whether that will change in the next 6 months or the next year, I don't know. It may be in their assessment of whether they can get away with waiting him out, if they could succeed in waiting him out. But that's what I think they want to do, and they want to go back. And maybe they're hopeful that there will be some future president that will go back into this deal. Now, I hope that that will never happen. And I hope that if there are people who argue for that, that people will ask them some tough questions. Because this is not 2015. In 2015, there was a question mark. What's going to happen if we do this deal? And I could have had my opinion, and General Amidjor, General Ayesh could have had their opinion. Other people can have other opinions. No one knew. But in 2018, we know exactly what did happen. We're dealing with the past. And so for somebody to come today and say, no, we want to stay with this deal, seems to me to be crazy. Because all it will do is fuel that aggression. All it will do is ensure that Iran has this path, ultimately, to a nuclear arsenal. And look, there's a moral issue here as well. I know people don't like to talk about moral issues anymore, but there is a moral issue. When you had the six-party talks with the Koreans, both President Clinton and President Bush, two of those six parties were the Japanese and the South Koreans. They were at the negotiating table, and they were pleading with both of those administrations to do those deals. And I think that carries moral weight, because the ones who have the most skin in the game, the ones whose lives are on the line, or at least the first line, when they're saying do that deal, that is hard for an American president to get up and say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to endanger my allies right in the region. With the nuclear deal with Iran, the P5+1 talks, Israel was not there. The Arab states were not there. And somebody told me a long time ago, if you're not sitting around the negotiating table, you're probably on the menu. And we who live there think that this is a disaster. So it's very nice that if the British ambassador or the French ambassador or the German ambassador, all wonderful people, are going to tell you, no, this is very good for peace and security in the Middle East, it doesn't have the same weight as your allies in the region who live there telling you that this is a disaster. We were the guinea pigs in this failed experiment, and I hope no American leader will come out and say, we want to go back to that failed experiment, because that would be a threat, again, to the survival of the state of Israel. We said it then, with question marks. Now I hope people can understand it today with exclamation marks. After we've seen what they've done, after we've revealed this nuclear archive, and after we've seen so many other things, I think the issue right now is to do what Secretary Pompeo said to you yesterday, which is you treat Iran like a normal country when it starts acting like a normal country. And that is exactly what the Prime Minister of Israel called for 3 years ago when he spoke to Congress. That's what his policy was. Don't have some sunset clause that the only thing that has to change is the calendar. Link it to Iran's behavior, to it stopping its aggression in the region, stopping being the foremost sponsor of terrorism, stopping calling for the annihilation of Israel, deal with all the issues, fully dismantling their nuclear weapons program, ending their ballistic missile program, and all their malign activities in the region. And I think what has to be done now is to ratchet up the pressure and to reach out to the people. Remember the other thing that was said by a few months ago when people said that Trump was going to withdraw from the deal? Remember they said that the Iranian people will rally behind the regime? Well, as the Prime Minister said, they're rallying. They're just rallying against the regime. And I think the Iranian people here are actually a partner. They don't represent a threat to Israel at all. We had a good relationship with Iran once. I believe we'll have a good relationship with Iran again. I think they were friends of the United States once, and I think they will be friends again, but they don't control their country. This fanatic, radical regime controls the country. And I think what you have to do right now with Iran is to adopt the Scoop-Jackson formula. You gave him the Scoop-Jackson Award yesterday, and that formula was very simple, and I stood at the, or I sat at the, you can't stand at the foot of Natan Sharansky because then it doesn't work quite. But I sat at the foot of Natan Sharansky for many years, him explaining to me exactly what worked, exactly how you were able to win that war without firing a shot. It's because you put massive pressure from the outside and you reached out to the dissidents and the people from the inside. That was the winning formula for success. That is the best policy for Israel. It's the best policy for our Arab neighbors, and I think it's the best policy for the peace and security of the world. And I have a feeling that if the United States advances that policy, that JINSA will be there supporting it with everything it's got. Thank you very much. I'll take questions if you want me to. I need to listen. Oh.
Yeah, we should have 10 minutes.
Oh, thank you. All right, so we have 10 minutes. All right, Maury.
Mr. Ambassador, would you agree that it's imperative for support for Israel in Congress must remain bipartisan?
Yes, definitely. And we have to work every day to make our case on both sides of the aisle, and we do. A lot of what you read out there is, are narratives of different parties that want to show that bipartisan support does not exist anymore. And we were blessed, by the way, with people on both sides of the aisle who were great friends of Israel. And you know, I did for Israel's Independence Day, I chose 70 Americans who I felt made a unique contribution in the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship in strengthening Israel. And you could see those senators that were there. And you had Scoop Jackson who was there, and you had Senator Inouye who was there, and you had Senator Lieberman who was there, and Hubert Humphrey who was there. So you have people, and sometimes things can change over the course of time. And we have great friends on the Republican side, we have great friends on the Democratic side, and we have to continue to work together. And a lot of it is, you know, it's sort of the optics. Look, I would have loved to have been in a position as Israel's ambassador the first 3 years that I was here, where I could walk to the White House and thank the Obama administration for confronting Iran every single day. It would have made my job much easier. But it didn't happen. And the opposition to that has nothing to do with what President Obama thinks on all these issues that concern Americans. It has to do with the difference of opinion that we had on a matter of national survival for Israel. And you know, I think people should look into what has driven changes within the parties. with regards to Israel, and I think it will surprise a lot of people when they actually look at the historical data and see there is a gap and how long that gap has existed. It didn't come from the last 10 years. It's existed much longer than that. And what are the driving factors, and how can we hope to address them? But I think the important thing is we have to advance our interests, and we have to do it in a way that will bring as many people on both sides of the aisle to achieve those goals. The Prime Minister's speech in Congress, in my mind, should not have been a matter of controversy at all. I think if the President of the United States, and as I said before, I think if the President of the United States were standing here and hooked up, former President Obama was hooked up to a lie detector, podium, and he said he believes a nuclear deal with Iran made America and Israel safer, I think he would be seen as speaking the truth. I don't question his motives. I just disagree with the policy. I think it was going to have the exact opposite effect. And I think likewise, when you look at Israel, don't question our motives. The Prime Minister of Israel sees this deal as a threat to the survival of his country. That's exactly how I see it. Now, ask yourself, what would a President of the United States do if he saw something as a threat to the survival of the United States of America? I don't care what his party is, who he is, what would he do? Where would he go? And I think a lot of the tension around the Iran deal resulted from people who had a different view of the deal seeing other people based on how they saw the deal and not how actually we saw the deal. And hopefully over time, we will be able to continue to build strong support, because look, it's a longer answer to your question, but look, I believe Israel is going to be the most important ally of the United States in the 21st century. I'm not saying that because we are aligned with the Trump administration on its policy towards Iran. That sentence I said in my first Independence Day speech as ambassador in 2014. I think the great security dangers facing the United States are going to emanate from the Middle East for decades to come. I think you don't want to have masses of troops there. And to the extent that you don't want to be there, having a formidable, reliable, democratic ally actually becomes more important, not less important. And when I think which country around the world can help American security, Israel, if not at the top of the list, is way up there on the list. And the second issue is technology. Israel's a global technological power. If 30 years ago, the Israeli ambassador would have been standing here and would have said, Israel's going to be a global technological power one day, you would have said, nice Jewish boy, but that's not going to happen. But it happened. And in agriculture, in water, in cyber, I think you're going to see it in healthcare, because we are this startup and really innovation nation. It's more than just a startup nation. Don't tell Dan Senor or Soul Singer that I said that, but we have the ability to create conceptual products, and we are leading in so many fields of the future. So if you think about from the U.S. national perspective, which country around the world is your best partner for technology? It's not Britain. It's not France. It's not Germany. It's actually Israel. It's the second great center of innovation in the world. So if I take a security and technology and I put them together, the next few decades, I see a coming together of the United States and Israel. Despite all these disagreements over this or that issue and whether Jews are building apartments in Jerusalem or not building apartments in Jerusalem, I think for the needs of your people, of your citizens, to keep them safe and keep them prosperous, there is no better partner in the world than Israel, and I think that will become more and more obvious in the years and decades ahead.
One more question. Hey, Devin.
I endorse every syllable of what you said. Oh, sorry. And thank you so much for coming. It was a superb talk. If we had to indulge in the horrible tradition of worst-case planning, which, as you know, my family is prone to doing.
I didn't notice.
Yeah, the prospect of possibly a Democratic Congress, could this treaty be forced again into the public, debate with all the, weighing in of our so-called allies in Europe, et cetera?
No, because it's not a treaty.
That's true.
Right. I think if it would have been a treaty, I mean, somebody I think yelled out before, nothing was ever signed. That's also true. You just use words like deal. But leaving that aside, if there would have been a treaty, then I think nothing, even the President of the United States could not have changed it. He'd have to lead. So I don't believe that a shift of either House of Congress will affect, because what basically had was all these pieces of legislation that had waivers in them. And the President obviously made a decision to not waive them and to enforce it. I don't see passing something within one house or both houses over a veto of the President of the United States that can change that policy. So I don't see any change in that in the short term, and I think that the President has been very clear about his desire to keep hitting the gas and maximizing pressure. And I think the more pressure they're feeling in Tehran, the better off the situation in Syria, the better off the situation in Lebanon, the better off the situation in Yemen and everything else. I mean, you want to deal with the octopus there and not the tentacles of the octopus. So I don't see that being a change. If there would be, and I don't think there's going to be an immediate political impact for Israel either way. I think the issue, though, would be the perception of maybe President Trump's strength. And the people who will want to wait him out might take some comfort in thinking, which may be the wrong, by the way, politically it could work just the opposite. As you know, if you have an opposition party on the other side, sometimes it can help from a political point of view. But it might be that some people are thinking, no, we just have to wait for this policy to end. What I'm hopeful for is that even though people clearly took sides on this debate, and they're still in the political arena, the former president has left, but all those senators, they clearly took positions. But I'm hoping that the facts on the ground and what has happened, both the failed experiment over about a year and a half or 2 years till the president started to change that policy, and the success of actually restoring these sanctions will convince people that no matter what they thought then, here's the reality we have today, and we should not go into that deal. I think to just pretend like the last 3 years didn't happen, either all the bad things that flowed from the nuclear deal or all the good things that have happened since he withdrew from the nuclear deal, I think will be a big mistake. But we'll see as people take their positions moving forward. I just think to go back into a deal, to give Iran hundreds of billions of dollars when we know exactly what they're going to do with that money would be a huge and a tragic mistake, and will take one hinge of history and turn us back right to where we were before. And I hope that it will never happen. One more question? One more. Yeah, I'm the boss. Yeah, I can answer one question.
Hey, Charles.
Hi, great job, Mr. Ambassador. When you talk about all those technological things that are going on in Israel, all those companies, or most of those companies, Microsoft, Apple, Intel, all of those companies, mostly are in California, but all over the United States. Has anybody gone to them and asked their leaders to speak out in support of Israel when the conflicts come? Because they all have a big proprietary self-interest for their own economic well-being, since so many great products are coming out of Israel that are owned by the American companies. And it seems like they're awful quiet when there's some issue going on, and they should be speaking out very forcefully.
I think it's an interesting point. I never thought of that specifically as a strategy to go to the 40 or 50 of the leading technology companies that have an R&D facilities in Israel. Look, this is one of the things that gets to the whole broader issue of BDS, of this attempt to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, which is an anti-Semitic movement. That's what it is. And the reason why it's an anti-Semitic movement, I don't put that scarlet, letter A on the breast of a movement easily, because we have to also be serious when you accuse somebody of anti-Semitism. The reason why it's anti-Semitism is because they're just treating the Jewish state to a different standard than any other country in the world. And the mark of anti-Semitism was to treat Jews differently than you treated other people. The mark of this new anti-Semitism, which is just the old anti-Semitism, with some lipstick on, and focusing not on the Jewish people but the Jewish state, is to treat Israel differently. So when somebody says to me, well, we want to boycott Israel, what do you think about that as Israel's ambassador? The first question I ask is, what number are we on their list? If there's a church group, if there's an academic group, if there's some international organization, they care deeply about this issue, and they've decided that they're going to boycott Israel, I want to know what number we are on their list. If we're number 41 or 71 or 121, then I know I'm dealing with an outfit that has a principle and that is applying its principle across the world, and it's catching a lot of countries there. I don't know what the principle is, but I know there is a principle. And I feel that my job as Israel's ambassador is to go there and to present them the facts, to explain to them why they're wrong about Israel. And that's when you get into the context, you get into peace initiatives, you get all sorts of things like that. But when I find out that there's a group that only has one country in the world that they single out, and it's not a Jewish group, which is much more complicated, because we don't have to ask Jews to care about all the problems of the world before they think about the problems of the Jewish state, or even Palestinians. I don't have an issue with Palestinians thinking first and foremost about their people. They don't have to be worried about what's going on in North Korea and in Syria and Iran and everything else before that. But when you have international organizations and groups that are not Jewish per se or Palestinian per se, and they've singled out Israel, and only Israel, there's a name for that principle. It's called anti-Semitism. Now, they may not know that. They may not appreciate that or understand it. I think it was Larry Summers who said he's not anti-Semitic in intent, but anti-Semitic in effect. It doesn't matter. We have to fight it. But I'll tell you the good news. The good news is the BDS is going to have zero economic impact on Israel. And the reason why is because those companies are not investing in Israel because they're Zionists. If they were, if the reason why the Microsofts and the Intels and the Ciscos or everything else is because they got a soft spot from somebody there in the organization for the state of Israel, I'd say, you know, we really got to fight this, because if that changes, if sort of anti-Zionism penetrates, that could have a huge impact on Israel's economy. The reason why those companies are in Israel is because they want access to our brain power and they want to make a lot of money. We have some of the most remarkable innovations in the world. We've got all these, by the way, all these people from around the world try to come to Israel. They send delegations to figure it out. They think it's in our air or in our water or something like that. Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's, no one's figured it out. I'm going to say it. Unfortunately, we have the camera, so it's going to be recorded exactly what the special secret is, the special sauce in Israel. It is not capitalism. That's important, but there are other capitalist countries. And Israel started as a socialist country, and part of the change you've seen is the freeing up of Israel's economy. True, but there are other capitalist economies in the world that don't have the innovation. It's not that. It's not genius alone. Genius, I think, is pretty spread out around the world. There's a lot of geniuses. We have, in addition to now free markets and genius, we have the secret ingredient, and that's chutzpah. And I'll explain what it means. The ones who win the Nobel Prizes, right? Jews account for 25%, I think, of the serious Nobel Prizes. I don't include, generally, the Peace Prize is sometimes serious, sometimes not. We'll leave it at that. But the serious chemistry, economics, Jews account for about 25% of Nobel Prizes. We're 1/4% of the world's population. It's an astounding difference. And Israel also has a very high number of Nobel Prizes. Why? Who wins the Nobel Prize? Is it the smartest kid in the class? Not always. It's the smartest kid in the class who has the chutzpah to challenge the professor. We've got a very anti-authoritarian impulse in our country. By the way, it makes Israel impossible to govern. And I always say to the Prime Minister, this may surprise you, occasionally he'll have a day when people are less than grateful for his leadership. Occasionally. And I say, what are you complaining about? Look at Moses. He does 10 plagues, splits the sea, goes up for 40 days and 40 nights. He's 8 hours late, gets a golden calf. We're tough people to govern. But it's this type of constantly trying to figure out a better mousetrap, constantly going at, challenging everybody. So you got 4 guys in Herzliya, and they're going to figure out, you know, a better mousetrap than Apple's producing over there in Silicon Valley. Who are those guys at Apple? Apple? Who cares? You know, we're going to come up with a better answer. And it's that type of gall that I think, combined with the genius that we have, and we do have genius, and combined with the free markets, that has created these tremendous opportunities. And those companies are coming in not because they read something in the New York Times or they care so much about the New York Times. They're coming in the same way the Chinese are interested and the Indians are interested and countries in Africa are interested and South America are interested. One of the things that is said about Israel that I hope people understand, Israel, the last few years, how many times have you heard that said Israel is more isolated than ever? All the time. Sort of stopped the last year, year and a half. But there was that narrative, Israel's more isolated. It is exactly the opposite. Israel is less isolated than ever. with our relations with India, with China, with Japan, with South America, with Africa. They're coming because they want to work with us on security, because they want to work with us in technology, because we're a great partner. And I'll just leave you with this. There was a survey recently of the most powerful countries in the world. Israel came in 8th. Okay, so you have the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. You have Japan and Germany, and then you have Israel. And this is not, by the way, a survey of the local Hadassah chapter of Nashville. We're 8th. We're a country of 9 million people that is 70 years old. Those other countries are much older and much, much bigger. 7, 8, 50 times bigger. Maybe not 50. 30, 20 times bigger than Israel. And it's remarkable what we have been able to achieve in 70 years. And despite all the problems that we have and all the challenges that we have, I never forget as Israel's ambassador that our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents would have given anything to trade their problems for ours. And so I'm very hopeful about Israel's future, and I know that this is an organization that will work every day to strengthen us and to strengthen the great alliance between our countries. Thank you.